Mental strength is not what most people think it is. It is not always confidence or optimism or resilience that looks impressive from outside. Often, genuine mental strength manifests in ways that are invisible to others and unrecognized even by the person who possesses it, appears as ordinary behaviors that seem unremarkable but actually require extraordinary psychological capacity, shows up in responses that might even be mistaken for weakness by those who do not understand what real strength looks like beneath its surface. The person with genuine mental strength often does not recognize it in themselves because they are measuring against wrong standards, comparing themselves to performances of strength rather than to actual strength, judging themselves by how they appear rather than by what they are actually capable of enduring and processing and integrating. They see their struggles and conclude they are weak, not recognizing that struggling consciously is itself a sign of strength. That awareness of difficulty indicates psychological sophistication rather than inadequacy. Mental strength is not absence of fear or pain or doubt, but is particular relationship to these experiences, is capacity to feel them fully while continuing to function, to acknowledge weakness while not being defined by it, to face difficulty without needing to pretend it is not difficult, to process rather than suppress what is hard about existence. The mentally strong person is often the one who appears to struggle visibly because they are not hiding behind defensive performances, are not pretending to be invulnerable, are not maintaining facades that look strong but actually indicate inability to face reality directly. Understanding mental strength requires recognizing signs that might not appear impressive, but that indicate genuine psychological capacity. Traits that the person themselves might not value or might even see as flaws, behaviors that look ordinary but actually require extraordinary inner resources. These are not the dramatic displays of strength that get celebrated, but are the quiet, consistent, often unnoticed ways that real mental fortitude manifests in daily life. The first sign of mental strength that most people do not recognize in themselves is the capacity to acknowledge difficulty without shame, to admit when things are hard rather than performing effortless competence, to say I am struggling rather than maintaining facade that everything is fine. This seems like weakness to most people, seems like failure or inability to cope, seems like something that should be hidden rather than acknowledged. But the opposite is true. The ability to face difficulty honestly, to recognize struggle without collapsing into it, to acknowledge pain without being destroyed by it. This requires more psychological strength than the defensive performances of invulnerability that most people mistake for actual strength. The person who can say, I do not know, I am afraid, I am having difficulty with this. This person has moved beyond the fragile ego that needs to appear competent at all times, has developed enough internal security that they can acknowledge limitation without experiencing it as catastrophic threat to their identity, has sufficient psychological ground to stand on that admitting weakness does not feel like it will destroy them. This is not the weakness it appears to be, but is actually profound strength, is the strength of not needing to defend against reality, of being able to see clearly what is actually happening, rather than maintaining illusions about how things should be. Most people cannot do this. They experience any admission of difficulty as intolerable threat, must maintain appearance of coping even when they are not, must perform strength even when they feel weak. You must hide struggle because acknowledging it feels like it would reveal them as inadequate or incompetent or fundamentally flawed. This defensive need to appear strong is actually a sign of weakness, is fragility masquerading as strength, is the brittle facade that can be maintained only by avoiding situations that would expose the weakness beneath it. The mentally strong person does not need this facade because they have faced their own limitations directly, have acknowledged their weakness and discovered that acknowledgement does not destroy them, have learned that saying, I am struggling, does not mean I am inadequate, but means I am human and I am facing something difficult. They can be vulnerable because vulnerability no longer threatens their core sense of self, can admit when they do not know because their worth is not dependent on appearing to know everything, can ask for help because needing help is not experienced as shameful failure. This creates a paradoxical situation where the person who appears weaker, who acknowledges struggle more openly, who does not maintain defensive performance of strength, this person is actually stronger psychologically than the one who must always appear invulnerable. The appearance of weakness indicates strength, while the performance of strength often indicates weakness. The admission of difficulty requires more courage than the denial of it. The willingness to be seen as struggling demonstrates more psychological capacity than the need to hide all signs of struggle. But the person with this capacity often does not recognize it as strength because they are comparing themselves to others who appear to cope effortlessly, who seem never to struggle, who maintain consistent performance of competence and invulnerability. They see their own acknowledgement of difficulty as evidence that they are less capable, do not recognize that what they are seeing in others is often performance rather than reality, is defensive facade rather than actual absence of struggle. They also judge themselves by cultural standards that equate strength with never showing weakness, with being able to handle everything without assistance, with appearing confident and capable at all times. By these standards, their willingness to acknowledge difficulty looks like failure. Their admission of struggle appears as inadequacy. Their requests for help seem like evidence that they cannot manage on their own. They do not recognize that these cultural standards are themselves problematic, are based on defensive ideal rather than on actual psychological health, are measuring performance of strength rather than genuine capacity. The irony is that the person who can acknowledge their struggles is often handling more difficulty than the person who appears to cope effortlessly, is facing challenges more directly rather than avoiding them, is processing difficulty consciously rather than suppressing it or defending against it. The acknowledgement of struggle is itself evidence of engagement with difficulty rather than avoidance of it, indicates that the person is confronting what is hard rather than hiding from it or pretending it does not exist. This capacity to acknowledge difficulty honestly is therefore a first sign of mental strength that people often do not recognize in themselves, is trait they might even judge as weakness, is behavior they might wish they could eliminate rather than recognizing it as indicating psychological sophistication and genuine fortitude that defensive performances of invulnerability actually lack. The second sign of mental strength that goes unrecognized is the capacity to tolerate uncertainty and discomfort without needing immediate resolution, to sit with not knowing rather than rushing to conclusions, to endure psychological tension without prematurely collapsing it through action or decision that provides relief but not actual solution. Most people experience uncertainty as unbearable, cannot stand not knowing what will happen, must resolve ambiguity quickly, even when quick resolution means accepting inadequate answers or making premature choices that create more problems than they solve. The mentally strong person can hold questions open, can live in the tension between possibilities without forcing premature closure, can endure the discomfort of not knowing while waiting for clarity to emerge or for better information to become available. This tolerance for uncertainty is not passivity or indecision, but is active choice to not act until action is genuinely warranted, to not decide until decision can be made with adequate understanding, to resist the psychological pressure, to resolve tension through premature commitment to answers that feel certain but are actually defensive responses to the anxiety that uncertainty creates. This capacity requires extraordinary psychological strength because uncertainty is deeply uncomfortable for most people, triggers anxiety that demands relief, creates tension that the mind wants to eliminate as quickly as possible. The person who cannot tolerate uncertainty will accept any answer that provides the feeling of certainty, will commit to decisions prematurely because commitment feels better than continued ambiguity, will force resolution even when the situation genuinely cannot be resolved yet, when more time or information would lead to better outcomes. The mentally strong person has learned to distinguish between productive action and defensive action, between decisions made because they are right and decisions made because not deciding is too uncomfortable. They recognize when their impulse to act or decide is coming from genuine understanding versus coming from intolerance of uncertainty, can feel the difference between clarity that emerges from actual insight and pseudo-clarity that comes from need to eliminate ambiguity, regardless of whether real understanding has been achieved. But this tolerance for uncertainty is often misinterpreted as indecisiveness by others and sometimes by the person themselves, appears as inability to commit, or as lack of confidence, rather than as sophisticated capacity to wait for genuine clarity. The person who forces quick decisions appears stronger, appears more confident and capable, appears to know what they are doing. The person who says, "I am not ready to decide yet, I need more information, I am still uncertain about this," this person appears weak or incompetent or unable to take action when action is required. The mentally strong person may judge themselves harshly for their inability to decide quickly, may see their tolerance for uncertainty as character flaw rather than as psychological strength, may wish they could be more like those who commit confidently, even when evidence is insufficient, or when situation is genuinely ambiguous. They do not recognize that quick, decisive action in uncertain situations is often not strength, but is defensive response to intolerance of uncertainty, is need to feel certain overriding actual assessment of whether certainty is justified. This capacity also extends to emotional discomfort, to ability to feel difficult emotions without immediately needing to eliminate them through action or distraction or substance or any of the countless ways people avoid feeling what they feel. The mentally strong person can sit with sadness without needing to immediately cheer themselves up, can feel anxiety without rushing to eliminate it, can experience anger without needing to discharge it, can endure loneliness without frantically seeking connection just to avoid being alone with themselves. This emotional tolerance is not stoicism or suppression, but is opposite. It is capacity to feel fully without being controlled by the feeling, to allow emotion to exist without needing to act on it or eliminate it, to recognize that feelings are temporary states that can be endured rather than emergencies that demand immediate response. The person who cannot tolerate emotional discomfort is constantly in reactive mode, constantly managing feelings through avoidance or discharge or distraction, never developing the capacity to simply feel what they feel and allow it to pass without interference. The mentally strong person has discovered that emotions, however intense, are not actually emergencies, that uncertainty, however uncomfortable, does not require immediate resolution, that discomfort can be endured without catastrophic consequences, that the impulse to eliminate tension quickly is itself often the problem rather than the solution. But they often do not recognize this capacity as strength because they are comparing themselves to those who appear never to experience uncertainty or discomfort, not recognizing that what they are seeing is often suppression or avoidance rather than actual absence of difficult internal states. The third sign of mental strength that people rarely recognize in themselves is the capacity to set boundaries and disappoint others when necessary, to say no even when yes would be easier or more popular, to prioritize their own needs and limits even when this creates conflict or makes them appear selfish. Most people experience boundary setting as impossibly difficult, feel overwhelming guilt when they disappoint others, cannot tolerate the disapproval that comes from refusing requests or from establishing limits on what they will accept or provide. The mentally strong person has developed capacity to tolerate others' disappointment without collapsing into guilt or changing the boundary to regain approval, can maintain their limits even when others are upset or angry or hurt, can prioritize their own well-being even when this means someone else does not get what they want. This seems like selfishness to most people, seems like failure to be generous or accommodating or caring, seems like putting yourself first in ways that good people should not do, but the opposite is true. The inability to set boundaries is not generosity but is weakness, is people-pleasing that comes from inability to tolerate disapproval rather than from genuine care for others, is self-abandonment disguised as selflessness. The person who cannot say no is not being kind, but is being controlled by fear of rejection or conflict or disappointing others, is sacrificing their own needs, not from authentic generosity, but from psychological inability to maintain boundaries when others push against them. The mentally strong person recognizes that boundaries are necessary for sustainable relationships, that saying yes when you mean no creates resentment, that poisons connection, that accommodating others at cost of your own well-being leads to burnout and bitterness, that genuine care for others requires also caring for yourself, rather than believing that virtue means complete self-sacrifice. They understand that disappointing others is sometimes necessary, that you cannot meet everyone's needs and should not try, that some people will be upset no matter what you do and their upset is not your responsibility to manage. But the person with this capacity often judges themselves harshly for it, feels guilty when they say no, experiences their boundaries as evidence that they are selfish or uncaring or inadequate. They see others who seem endlessly accommodating, who never refuse requests, who appear able to meet everyone's needs without difficulty, and they conclude that their own need for boundaries indicates weakness or selfishness or inability to be as generous as they should be. They do not recognize that what they are seeing in these apparently boundaryless people is often not genuine generosity, but is inability to say no, is people-pleasing that will eventually lead to breakdown, is performance of endless availability that cannot be sustained. They do not see the resentment building beneath the accommodating surface, do not recognize that the person who never says no is often angry and exhausted, but cannot express this without threatening the identity they have built around being endlessly available. The capacity to set boundaries also requires distinguishing between guilt that indicates genuine wrongdoing and guilt that is simply discomfort with others' disappointment. The mentally strong person has learned that feeling guilty does not mean you have done something wrong, that others being upset does not mean you should change your boundary, that someone wanting something from you does not create obligation to provide it. This is sophisticated psychological discrimination that most people never develop, continue throughout their lives, experiencing others' disappointment as indication that they have failed or been selfish or should have accommodated the request. The mentally strong person can feel the guilt, can notice the discomfort of disappointing someone, can recognize the desire to change the boundary to regain approval, and can maintain the boundary anyway. You can tolerate these uncomfortable feelings without being controlled by them. This is not callousness or lack of empathy, but is recognition that sustainable relationships require limits, that you cannot care for others effectively if you do not also care for yourself, that boundaries are not rejections but are necessary structures that make genuine connection possible rather than impossible. But because this capacity appears as selfishness to those who cannot tolerate disappointing others, and because the mentally strong person themselves often feels guilty when exercising it, they rarely recognize it as strength. They see it as flaw they wish they could eliminate, as evidence that they are not generous enough or caring enough, as failure to be the endlessly accommodating person they believe they should be. They do not recognize that what they judge as weakness is actually psychological strength that most people lack. The fourth sign of mental strength that remains unrecognized is the capacity to change your mind when presented with new evidence, to admit you were wrong without experiencing this as catastrophic failure, to update your beliefs based on new information rather than defending positions you no longer actually hold just to maintain consistency or avoid appearing uncertain. Most people experience changing their mind as intolerable weakness, as flip-flopping or inconsistency, as evidence that they did not think carefully enough initially or that they cannot be trusted to maintain stable positions. The mentally strong person has moved beyond the fragile ego that needs to be right, that experiences being wrong as shameful failure, that must defend all positions once taken regardless of whether new information contradicts them. They can say, "I was wrong about that. I have changed my thinking on this. I no longer believe what I used to believe," without experiencing this admission as devastating blow to their identity or credibility. They recognize that changing your mind based on new evidence is not weakness, but is intellectual honesty, is willingness to prioritize truth over ego, is capacity to learn, rather than remaining trapped in positions that are no longer justified. This capacity requires separating self-worth from being right, requires recognizing that you are not your beliefs, and that updating beliefs does not mean you are fundamentally flawed or incompetent. Most people cannot make this separation, experience challenges to their beliefs as challenges to their identity, must defend their positions because losing an argument feels like losing themselves, cannot admit being wrong because wrongness is experienced as personal inadequacy rather than as natural consequence of having incomplete information or faulty reasoning that new evidence corrects. The mentally strong person has discovered that being wrong about specific things does not mean being wrong as a person, that mistakes in thinking are inevitable and correctable rather than shameful, that clinging to positions you no longer believe just to avoid appearing inconsistent is actually less respectable than acknowledging you have learned something new and have updated accordingly. They can engage with arguments and evidence without defensive need to win, can consider perspectives that contradict their own without experiencing this as threats, can follow reasoning wherever it leads rather than only accepting conclusions that confirm what they already believe. But this openness to changing one's mind is often interpreted as weakness both by others and by the person themselves. The person who maintains consistent positions appears stronger, appears more confident and certain, appears to have thought things through completely rather than being swayed by every new argument. The person who says, "I used to think X, but now I think Y," appears indecisive, appears easily influenced, appears to lack the conviction that strong people supposedly possess. The mentally strong person may judge themselves for their willingness to change their mind, may see it as evidence that they are not thinking rigorously enough initially, may wish they could be more like those who maintain unwavering positions throughout their lives, regardless of what evidence emerges. They do not recognize that unwavering conviction in the face of contradictory evidence is not strength, but is rigidity, is defensive protection of ego rather than genuine pursuit of truth, is prioritizing appearing right over actually being right. This capacity also extends to admitting mistakes in action, not just in belief, to acknowledging when choices were wrong or when behavior caused harm, to taking responsibility without defensive justifications or without collapsing into shame that prevents the acknowledgement. The mentally strong person can say, "I made a mistake. I should not have done that. I take responsibility for the harm this caused," without needing to explain it away or to justify it, or to become so overwhelmed by guilt that the admission becomes about seeking reassurance rather than about genuine accountability. Most people cannot do this cleanly. They either cannot admit mistakes at all, must defend and justify and explain until the mistake is reframed as not really a mistake, or they collapse into excessive self-flagellation that is actually another form of avoiding responsibility, because the focus shifts from the harm caused to how terrible they feel about having caused it. The mentally strong person can hold the middle ground, acknowledging the mistake clearly, taking responsibility without defense or excuse, feeling appropriate remorse without being destroyed by it, making amends where possible, and moving forward having learned from the error. But because this capacity appears as inconsistency, or as inability to maintain positions, and because the mentally strong person themselves often wishes they could be more certain and unwavering, they rarely recognize their flexibility and openness to being wrong as the psychological strength it actually represents. The fifth sign of mental strength that goes unrecognized is the capacity to ask for help when you need it, to acknowledge when you cannot handle something alone, to reach out rather than suffering in isolation, because admitting you need assistance feels like shameful failure. Most people experience asking for help as intolerable vulnerability, as admission of inadequacy, as evidence that they are not capable or strong or self-sufficient enough. They will struggle alone, will exhaust themselves trying to manage what they cannot manage, will fail rather than ask for the support that would allow them to succeed. The mentally strong person has moved beyond the belief that needing help indicates weakness, has recognized that asking for assistance is not failure but is wisdom, is accurate assessment of their own limits and the resources available, is choosing effectiveness over ego. They can say, "I need help with this. I cannot do this alone. I do not have the knowledge or capacity to handle this by myself," without experiencing these admissions as devastating blows to their competence or worth. This capacity requires separating self-worth from complete self-sufficiency, requires recognizing that humans are interdependent rather than independent, that relying on others is not weakness but is acknowledgement of reality that no one can do everything alone. Most people cannot make this distinction, experience any need for help as evidence of personal inadequacy, must maintain facade of complete self-sufficiency, even when this prevents them from accessing resources that would solve their problems or relieve their suffering. The mentally strong person understands that asking for help is not about being rescued or about having others solve your problems for you, but is about being strategic in how you deploy your own limited resources, and about accessing expertise or support that complements rather than replaces your own efforts. They can ask for help without feeling diminished by it, can receive assistance without experiencing it as proof that they are incompetent, can collaborate without needing to prove they could have done it alone if they had really tried. But asking for help is almost universally interpreted as weakness, both by others who see it as evidence of inability to cope, and by the person themselves who may feel ashamed even as they recognize the necessity. The person who struggles alone appears stronger, appears more capable and independent, appears to have the fortitude to handle difficulties without assistance. The person who asks for help appears weak, appears unable to manage on their own, appears to lack the strength or competence to solve their own problems. The mentally strong person often judges themselves harshly for needing help, sees their inability to handle everything alone as personal failure, wishes they could be more self-sufficient, rather than recognizing that their willingness to ask for help demonstrates psychological sophistication and genuine strength. They compare themselves to those who appear never to need assistance, who seem to manage everything independently, who maintain appearance of complete self-sufficiency, not recognizing that what they are seeing is often defensive performance rather than actual capability. They do not see that those who never ask for help are often suffering unnecessarily, are failing when they could succeed if they accessed available resources, are sacrificing effectiveness to maintain ego, are letting problems worsen because addressing them would require the intolerable vulnerability of admitting they need assistance. The person who asks for help when needed often accomplishes more, manages better, solves problems more effectively than the person who must struggle alone to prove their independence. This capacity also requires distinguishing between appropriate requests for help and excessive dependence, between asking for assistance with what genuinely exceeds your capacity versus expecting others to do what you could and should do yourself. The mentally strong person can make this discrimination, knows when they need help and when they need to push through difficulty on their own, can ask for specific assistance without expecting to be rescued, can receive help without becoming dependent on continued help. They also understand that asking for help is not one-directional transaction that creates debt or obligation, but is part of reciprocal human relationships where people support each other through different difficulties at different times. They can ask for help without feeling they are burdening others, can receive assistance without excessive guilt. You can trust that the support they need now does not mean they are inadequate, but means they are human, and that others who help them may need their help at other times. But because the cultural message is so strong that self-sufficiency is strength and needing help is weakness, even the mentally strong person who can ask for help often does not recognize this capacity as the psychological fortitude it represents. The sixth sign of mental strength that people rarely recognize in themselves is the capacity to feel emotions fully rather than avoiding them, to process sadness or anger or fear without immediately trying to eliminate these feelings, to allow difficult emotions to exist and move through you rather than suppressing them or distracting yourself or rushing to make them stop. Most people experience difficult emotions as emergencies that must be resolved immediately, cannot tolerate feeling bad without taking action to feel better, must distract or numb or discharge or avoid, rather than simply allowing the emotion to be present and to complete its natural cycle. The mentally strong person has learned that emotions are not emergencies, that feeling sad or angry or afraid does not require immediate intervention, that these feelings can be experienced fully and will pass on their own without needing to be fixed or eliminated or avoided. They can sit with grief without rushing to cheer themselves up, can feel anger without needing to discharge it through aggressive action or suppression, can experience anxiety without immediately seeking relief through distraction or substance or compulsive activity. This emotional capacity is not stoicism or suppression, but is opposite. It is willingness to feel what you actually feel, rather than avoiding it or pretending it is not there, or trying to think your way out of it. The mentally strong person has discovered that emotions that are allowed to be felt will move through and complete their cycle, while emotions that are avoided or suppressed will persist and intensify, will create ongoing psychological burden, will emerge in distorted forms that are more difficult to manage than the original feeling would have been if it had been allowed direct expression. But the capacity to feel emotions fully is almost never recognized as strength because it looks like the opposite. It appears as being overwhelmed, as being unable to cope, as lacking the resilience to bounce back quickly from difficult feelings. The person who can distract themselves immediately after setback appears stronger, appears more resilient, appears to have better coping skills. The person who needs to sit with their sadness for days or weeks, who cannot just move on quickly, who allows themselves to feel the full weight of loss or disappointment or fear, this person appears weak or stuck or unable to regulate their emotions effectively. The mentally strong person often judges themselves harshly for their emotional processing, sees their inability to quickly move past difficult feelings as evidence that they are not resilient enough, not strong enough, not capable of the emotional regulation that others seem to manage effortlessly. They wish they could bounce back faster, could distract themselves more successfully, could avoid the painful process of actually feeling what they feel, rather than spending days or weeks processing emotions that others seem to handle in hours. They do not recognize that what they are seeing in those who appear to move past emotions quickly is often not genuine processing, but is avoidance, is suppression that will create problems later, is refusal to feel what needs to be felt because feeling it is too uncomfortable. The person who appears to cope effortlessly is often the person who is not actually coping, but is postponing the emotional reckoning that will eventually come, is accumulating unprocessed feelings that will emerge later in more difficult forms. The mentally strong person who allows full emotional processing is actually doing the difficult work that others are avoiding, is facing what others are running from, is experiencing consciously what others are keeping unconscious. This is not weakness, but is psychological courage, is willingness to be with discomfort rather than constantly fleeing from it, is recognition that some things must be felt rather than thought about or avoided or fixed. This capacity also extends to not pathologizing normal emotional responses, to recognizing that sadness after loss is appropriate rather than being depression that needs treatment, that anxiety before challenge is normal rather than being disorder that needs elimination, that anger in response to injustice is healthy rather than being problem that needs management. The mentally strong person can distinguish between emotions that are proportionate responses to circumstances and emotions that are disproportionate and might indicate need for intervention. They can feel deeply sad after breakup or death without concluding they are depressed and need medication. They can experience significant anxiety before important event without diagnosing themselves with anxiety disorder. They can feel intense anger about genuine injustice without believing this anger means they have anger management problems. They trust their emotional responses, recognize them as information rather than as pathology, allow them to exist without immediately trying to eliminate them or fix them or medicate them away. But because the cultural message is that negative emotions should be minimized and eliminated as quickly as possible, that resilience means bouncing back fast rather than processing deeply, the mentally strong person who allows full emotional experience often does not recognize this capacity as the psychological fortitude it represents. The seventh sign of mental strength that remains unrecognized is the capacity to be alone without being lonely, to enjoy solitude rather than experiencing it as exile, to have rich internal life that does not require constant external stimulation or validation or connection to feel worthwhile. Most people experience being alone as punishment, cannot tolerate their own company without distraction, must constantly seek social interaction or entertainment or activity to avoid confronting themselves in quiet solitude. The mentally strong person has developed internal resources that make solitude not just tolerable but valuable, has cultivated relationship with themselves that does not require constant external input, can spend time alone without experiencing this as evidence of social failure or as unbearable emptiness that must be filled immediately. They can enjoy their own thoughts, can engage with ideas or creative pursuits or simple quiet without needing others present, can be content in their own company rather than experiencing aloneness as deprivation. This capacity is not introversion necessarily, though introverts may find it easier to develop. It is about having done enough psychological work that you are not running from yourself. That being alone does not mean confronting aspects of yourself you cannot face, that solitude is chosen engagement with internal life rather than forced isolation from external connections you desperately need. The mentally strong person can be alone because they have developed self that is worth being alone with. You have processed enough unresolved material that silence is not filled with intrusive thoughts or overwhelming emotions. They must escape. But the capacity for solitude is almost always interpreted as loneliness or as social failure, both by others who see you spending time alone and by yourself when you recognize that you do not need constant social contact the way others seem to. The person who cannot be alone appears more socially successful, appears more connected and popular, appears to have the relationships and social skills that the solitary person supposedly lacks. The person who spends significant time alone appears isolated, appears to lack friends or social opportunities, appears unable to connect in ways that healthy people supposedly can. The mentally strong person often judges themselves for their comfort with solitude, sees their lack of constant social engagement as evidence that they are not normal, wishes they needed people more or enjoyed social interaction more, rather than recognizing that their capacity for solitude indicates psychological development and genuine self-sufficiency. They compare themselves to those who cannot tolerate being alone for even brief periods, who must constantly be surrounded by others or distracted by entertainment, and they conclude that something is wrong with them for not sharing this need. They do not recognize that inability to be alone is often a sign of weakness rather than strength, indicates dependence on external validation or distraction, suggests that the person cannot face themselves in quiet solitude because what they would face is too uncomfortable or too empty. The person who needs constant social contact is often running from themselves, is using others to avoid internal life they have not developed or cannot tolerate, is mistaking quantity of social interaction for quality of connection. The mentally strong person who can be alone has typically developed this capacity through having done internal work that others avoid, through having faced themselves honestly enough that solitude is not threatening, through having cultivated interests and thoughts, an internal richness that makes being alone engaging rather than merely endurable. This is not isolation or withdrawal, but is balance, is capacity for both genuine connection with others and genuine engagement with self, is being able to move between social engagement and solitude based on what is needed rather than based on inability to tolerate one or the other. This capacity also means not needing constant external validation, not requiring others to confirm your worth or your choices, not depending on social approval to maintain sense that you are acceptable or valuable. The mentally strong person has developed enough internal validation that they can make choices based on their own assessment, rather than on what others will think, can pursue interests that others do not understand or value, can be different without this difference creating unbearable anxiety about being rejected or judged. But because capacity for solitude appears as social failure to those who cannot tolerate being alone, and because the mentally strong person themselves often wishes they were more socially oriented or more dependent on constant connection, they rarely recognize their comfort with solitude as the psychological strength it represents, as evidence that they have developed internal resources and self-relationship that most people never achieve. Conclusion: these 7 signs of mental strength are rarely recognized because they do not match cultural narratives about what strength looks like, because they appear as weakness to those who measure strength by defensive performances of invulnerability, because even the people who possess these capacities often judge themselves against wrong standards and conclude they are inadequate, rather than recognizing the psychological sophistication their behaviors actually demonstrate. The capacity to acknowledge difficulty without shame looks like weakness, but requires more strength than defensive pretense that everything is fine. The tolerance for uncertainty and discomfort appears as indecisiveness, but is actually sophisticated ability to resist premature closure. The willingness to set boundaries seems selfish, but is necessary for sustainable relationships and genuine self-care. The openness to changing your mind looks like inconsistency, but is intellectual honesty and commitment to truth over ego. The ability to ask for help appears as inadequacy, but is strategic wisdom and recognition of human interdependence. The capacity to feel emotions fully seems like being overwhelmed, but is psychological courage to face what others avoid. The comfort with solitude looks like social failure, but indicates internal development and genuine self-sufficiency that constant social engagement often masks. These signs are valuable precisely because they are difficult, because they require psychological work that most people never do, because they indicate having moved beyond defensive performances into genuine strength that does not need to prove itself through appearances. The mentally strong person is often the one who appears to struggle because they are facing reality directly rather than hiding behind facades, who admits difficulty because they have enough internal security to acknowledge limitation, who processes emotions deeply because they have courage to feel what others avoid. Understanding these signs matters for those who possess them but do not recognize their value, who judge themselves by standards that measure performance rather than genuine capacity, who compare themselves to defensive displays of strength rather than to actual psychological fortitude. It matters for recognizing that the struggles you see as weaknesses are often signs of engagement with difficulty that others avoid, that your apparent inadequacies are often sophisticated capacities that superficial strength lacks. The question is not whether you possess these signs, but whether you can recognize them as strength rather than weakness, whether you can value your own psychological capacities rather than judging them against performances that look impressive but indicate fragility. Mental strength is not about never struggling, but about how you struggle. Not about appearing invulnerable, but about facing vulnerability honestly. Not about meeting cultural standards of strength, but about developing genuine psychological capacities that allow you to live authentically rather than defensively. If you recognize these signs in yourself, if you acknowledge difficulty, tolerate uncertainty, set boundaries, change your mind, ask for help, feel emotions fully, and can be alone without being lonely, then you possess mental strength even if you do not recognize it, even if it does not appear impressive. Even if you judge yourself as weak for displaying traits that actually indicate psychological sophistication most people never achieve. The strength is real even when unrecognized. is valuable even when invisible, is evidence of psychological work and genuine capacity regardless of whether it appears as strength to those who measure by wrong standards.